Okay, welcome to Lecture 10, the second and last of my lectures on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Du Contrat Social, dealing with his text on the social contract. This is, of course, though, not going to be the last we hear of Rousseau in this course, because we will be circling back later in the semester to his discourse on the origin of inequality. That will be part of the lead up to our closing discussion of Marx and Marxism that will conclude the semester. But as far as the social contract is concerned, this lecture and the last one are all I'm going to have to offer. By the way, I should say, if you hear strange noises in the background, the reason for this is that my study is currently under attack by squirrels who are hurling acorns down from some very tall oak trees that stand around the building. When they pelt the roof of my study with these acorns, it actually makes quite a racket. So if you hear strange noises in the background, don't be alarmed, that's all it is. So in the last lecture, I tried to give you a rough and ready account of what Rousseau is up to in the social contract. I tried to show that he's taking a basically Hobbesian concept of sovereignty and radicalizing it in a strongly democratic direction. What Rousseau ends up saying is that in the end of the day, sovereignty can only legitimately be held by the same people over whom it is exercised. So he asks us to imagine a radically democratic sovereign that is constituted by the full body of the citizens of a political community, each of whom is both equally subject to the laws that are resolved on by the sovereign, but each of whom is also equally in a position to contribute to the decisions of the sovereign as to how the laws should be configured. So each of us has an equal voice in the determination of sovereign decision, and each of us is equally subject to sovereign decision making. And as I was trying to suggest, Rousseau sees this process as one in which a self-determining political community searches for and seeks to disclose its own common will, what it really wants for itself. A community of free and independent individuals who are concerned to protect their own freedom, come together with that general aim in mind and decide together on how they're going to be a free and independent people. And Rousseau refers to this common will as the general will. And I tried to, at least a little bit, demystify that notion in the last lecture, though I won't have successfully removed all perplexity from that notion, because Rousseau's concept of the general will has been and will, I think, remain one of the most contested and unsettled notions in the entire Western tradition. As you will have discovered from reading this text, Du Contrat Social is a frustrating, enigmatic, often cryptic work. Rousseau doesn't always work hard enough to unpack his leading ideas. And one result of this is that interpreters have differed very, very widely on the meaning of Rousseau's doctrine and the implications of his argument. And I want to frame this lecture around a very particular division that has arisen between different interpreters of Rousseau, because some of his readers have read Du Contrat Social as a profoundly liberal book, as a book that is essentially devoted to protecting individual liberty from predation and various forms of oppression. Read that way, Rousseau is a friend of individual freedom and should be read as defending a kind of classical liberal position. But they have tended to be opposed by a different school of thought that have argued that whatever his intentions were, Rousseau's argument actually points in a very strongly totalitarian direction. Indeed, some figures, including Jacob Talman, whom I quoted at the beginning of the last lecture. He wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy. The title kind of gives the game away. And he held Rousseau responsible, as many others have too, for thinking about social organization in a problematically totalitarian way. So for figures like Talman, the terror of the French Revolution authentically represents the working out of a Rousseauan view, and the totalitarian regimes that developed in the 20th century in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, and in the Far East and some other places around the world, these are all regimes that owe something in their inspiration to some of Rousseau's ideas. Since I'm going to frame today's discussion around this general opposition, I want to say just a little bit more about how each of these readings of Du Contrat Social goes. So on the liberal view, the liberal construal, when Rousseau talks about the general will, we should just read that as a code word for an idealized set of civil laws that will reconcile individual freedom and equality through some appropriately deliberative democratic set of procedures. And many who take that view are inclined to see Rousseau's social contract as anticipating the sort of view that you get, for example, in the 1971 book that was published by the great American political philosopher John Rawls, A Theory of Justice. And indeed, John Rawls himself was heavily influenced by Rousseau and thought of his own theory in that book as a variation on a basic idea that you can find in Du Contrat Social by Rousseau. Those of you who've read Rawls's theory in other classes will perhaps remember that the centerpiece of Rawls's argument in A Theory of Justice is this idea that legitimate rules of justice are those that would be chosen by free and equal persons behind what Rawls famously calls a veil of ignorance, right? And his idea is that in order to figure out what an ideally just society would look like, we have to imagine ourselves choosing its basic rules as if we were ignorant of our real identities, right? So we meet, as it were, to hash out what the rules we're prepared to live by would look like, but under conditions in which we're ignorant of who we are, right? So we don't know whether we're men or women. We don't know our social position or class in the society that we're eventually going to live in. We don't know our racial or ethnic background. We don't know our sexual orientation. We don't know whether we're rich or whether we're poor. We don't know our psychological makeup, whether we're very cautious or more impetuous, right? We know nothing about who we really are. And you can perhaps see why that idea has been linked by many people to Rousseau's idea of a general will, because to run this story through in Rousseauan language, Rousseau might say, well, all of these particular features of my identity, right, my ethnic background, my religious predispositions, my tastes, my appetites, my gender, my sexual orientation, they all speak to aspects of my particular will, right? They all speak to things that I want for myself in virtue of who I am and in virtue of my partiality to myself. But Rawls wants to say that the reason to impose the veil of ignorance and to try to bracket all of this information about who we particularly are is to repair to a standpoint that is genuinely impartial, a standpoint that is genuinely that of all of us together and not just a standpoint of a particular point of view, right? And it's not too much of a stretch to see that what Rawls is reaching for is something that looks like a general will, a kind of impartial standpoint that represents the point of view of the community as a whole, rather than any particular individual or group that might be within it. So that's, roughly speaking, how the liberal reading goes. The totalitarian reading of Rousseau's social contract tends to focus on his commitment to a positive conception of freedom, one that says that obedience to a law which we prescribe to ourselves is liberty, And as Berlin himself argued, Berlin, of course, the originator of this positive-negative liberty distinction, as he himself argued, one potentially troubling feature of that formulation is that it tends to conflate freedom and obedience and discipline. And when that's combined with Rousseau's claim that those who disobey the general will must be forced to be free, you wind up with a situation that you wind up with a view that purports to be promoting liberty, but in fact equates liberty with disciplining people into alignment with what society wants people to do. And that, they say, is the road to, totalitarianism and this totalitarian idea that what you really want is what the state wants for you, right? And so we have struggle sessions and self-criticism to re-educate people who seem to be enemies of the people, to bring them back into alignment with the general will. And on that totalitarian reading, Rousseau is, as I say, an enemy of freedom. Now, I personally think that neither of these readings of Rousseau get him quite right, although, as you'll see, there are certainly it's not too difficult to understand why they have gotten going, given what Rousseau actually says in the social contract. But I do think that understanding their shortcomings, which I'll get to at the end of this lecture, will help us to see exactly what Rousseau's political theory is about a little bit more sharply. So that's why I'm choosing to frame this lecture in terms of that debate between a liberal and totalitarian reading. The liberal interpretation derives its plausibility from Rousseau's fairly clear and repeatedly avowed aim of preserving the freedom and independence of each and every individual in society. There are lots of passages one could cite, but here's one from the 8th letter from the mountain that's in your short excerpt, which I posted to Colab. Rousseau says, "In the common liberty, no one has the right to do what the liberty of another forbids him. And true liberty is never self-destructive. Liberty without justice is a complete contradiction." And as I say, there are lots of other passages in Du Contrat Social which you can read as saying something very, very similar. And I think it's hard to disagree that, at least in terms of his intentions, Rousseau is aiming at an outcome that most classical liberals, most people who would describe themselves as friends of individual freedom, would be perfectly happy to sign on to. The totalitarian interpretation, however, derives from an observation that I already mentioned in the last lecture, which is that even Rousseau seems to see that his formula doesn't guarantee automatically that individual freedom and independence will be properly respected, right? That is, he clearly doesn't think that having a popular sovereign whose members vote as equals on all of the laws that apply to all of them, he plainly doesn't think that that's alone sufficient to automatically guarantee that no individual's freedom or independence are threatened by decisions made by the sovereign. In these passages, Rousseau makes it clear that the general will won't just automatically emerge from exercises of popular sovereignty. What he clearly believes is that whether the general will properly emerge through the activity of citizens engaging in general willing and exercising sovereignty, depends on whether a whole raft of other conditions are met. And I'm going to talk about these other conditions in some detail. I think you can gather them. This is a little artificial. It's not a categorization that Rousseau himself uses, but I'm just going to use it for purposes of organization. It seems to me that you can group these other conditions under 4 general heads. There's a set of deliberative conditions that he thinks you have to meet. There are a set of institutional conditions. There are a number of economic conditions, and there are a number of cultural and psychological conditions. And broadly speaking, the totalitarian reading of Rousseau is founded upon the worry that when you actually look at the practical implications of all of these other conditions that Rousseau introduces, you'll discover that they point in a repressive rather than a freedom-enhancing direction. So I'm going to focus in the body of this lecture on these various other conditions that Rousseau mentions, describe them, explain what he means by them, and then at the end I'll come back to this disagreement between the liberal and totalitarian interpretations and try to reach a conclusion about the senses in which they're right and the senses in which they're wrong. So the first general category that I want to talk about concerns the conditions under which members of the sovereign deliberate before they vote on general laws that apply to all of them. Because Rousseau says a number of things about how citizens ought ideally to deliberate. Most importantly, Rousseau says that when considering what laws to vote for, citizens as members of the sovereign, citizens who are engaging in this procedure whereby they attempt to identify their general will by voting together in a popular assembly. When considering what laws they should support or oppose or vote for or not vote for, they should above all make up their own minds, and they should make up their own minds on that question based not on the question of what will benefit them personally, because then they'll be deciding on the basis of their particular wills, their particular interests, their private preferences. They shouldn't vote their personal preferences. They should instead, as far as possible, try to make a good faith assessment of which policy is going to be better, which law, I should say, which law is going to be best for everyone, which will promote the common good of everyone in their society, right? So they shouldn't vote just on the basis of their narrow self-interest. They should vote on the basis of a good faith assessment of what's best for everyone in their society. And as Rousseau says, if citizens simply vote on their private preferences, on their particular wills, all you'll get is something that he calls the will of all, a kind of aggregate summary of the range of people's private preferences. And that, Rousseau wants to say, is completely different from the general will, because the general will is something that we have to be able to say we all agree on together. And simply giving us a kind of distribution range of the private preferences of different separate individuals, that's not going to give you what you want, right? The general will is something more than just the aggregate of each individual preference added all together to give you something he calls the will of all. When individuals deliberate about this good faith assessment of which laws are worthy of their support, Rousseau insists that they should deliberate independently, right? They should think about this just for themselves. So in one way, it's individualistic, and in another way, it's sort of more altruistic, right? So they should deliberate completely independently as individuals, right? They shouldn't communicate much with other people. They shouldn't engage in town hall meetings. They should repair to their private studies and contemplate the question of what would be best for everyone, largely on an independent basis, right? So they're thinking about the common good, but they're thinking about the common good just from their own point of view, right? That's an interesting thing. And this, of course, is one of the places where people see a kind of overlap between Rousseau's approach and the kind of approach that you get in Rawls, where you've got this veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance forces us to think about everyone because we don't know who we are. But nonetheless, when we make these judgments behind the veil of ignorance, we vote from our own point of view, even though our own point of view is going to be more or less the same as everyone's, right? So that's one of the places where people see a kind of overlap between Rousseau's view and Rawls's. There's another important set of deliberative preconditions that I think deserve mention here. The laws on which citizens are to vote have to first be proposed or framed, and maybe even written, by lawgivers or a legislator. And Rousseau, I think, is getting at something that people often overlook, which is that it's not really plausible to imagine exercises of popular sovereignty in which people come together and talk about what laws they ought to consider voting on, right? So that the actual proposals on which members of the sovereign get to vote just kind of emerge spontaneously from a kind of communication within the citizen body about what laws they want to consider. Rather, Rousseau seems to have in mind a view in which the laws, the actual written documents, the proposals that individual citizens get to vote on when they're participating in general willing are framed by other people. They're framed by these figures who are variously described as lawgivers or as legislators. Now, what confuses people about this is that in the text, Rousseau often clearly has in mind as paradigm examples of legislators those who are founders of republics, people like Solon in Athens, the great lawgiver, the guy who sort of lays down, in some sense, the fundamental constitution of Athens, or Lycurgus in Sparta, or in the American context, the American founders, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, these people who were present at the birth of the nation and who kind of got the conversation going by defining the kind of basic outline terms on which political discussion is going to go within that political community. And so often he's thinking of legislators as these figures who are present at the origin of particular states and who define the terms on which politics in that jurisdiction are going to go from that point forward. But I think it's important to keep in mind that Rousseau also talks about the legislator as having an ongoing role in his social contract state. He talks about the legislator as holding an office in the state, and he regards that office as being in some sense central to the Constitution. And I take it, this is perhaps controversial, you'd be curious to hear what you think about it, but I take it that what Rousseau has in mind here is the general idea that on an ongoing basis, the popular sovereign is going to have fed to it certain concrete legal proposals, right? And there are going to have to be people in society that craft those proposals, write them out, make them, and then put them before the popular sovereign for a vote as to whether they are to be incorporated into the general will or rejected from the general will. And I think it's quite clear, therefore, that Rousseau is thinking of a role that is going to be continuous throughout the life of a republic. There are going to be figures in a society who are going to be basically responsible for writing the laws that the popular sovereign then votes on. And I think it's important, therefore, to keep in mind that one of the preconditions that Rousseau has in mind for the successful emergence of the general will is a cadre of lawgivers or legislators who can be trusted to put before the public laws that are genuinely worth considering, and that are themselves laws that, as it were, stand a fighting chance of incorporating or being consistent with the general will, the will of the whole community. And it's clear from the discussion that there are ways in which the role of the lawgiver or the legislator could be abused, right? Especially if, for example, lawgivers or legislators, the people who craft laws that are up for consideration, are influenced by their particular wills, right? I mean, I think this is what he would say about, today in our society, because of the extensive influence of lobbyists on the legislative process, large sections of laws that get passed by Congress are actually written by lobbyists on behalf of big moneyed interests, right? And Rousseau would say, well, this is a case of the law-giving process going badly wrong, because in that sort of case, the voters and their representatives are being asked to consider laws that are already tainted by a certain kind of bias towards particularity and a particular will and partiality, right? And whatever he means by lawgivers or legislators, they have to be motivated not by some partial point of view of that kind. There are also various institutional preconditions that Rousseau insists on, and I've already kind of alluded to perhaps the most important of these. Rousseau thinks that the existence of what he calls partial associations or political factions are always inimical to the deliberations of a popular sovereign that is concerned to identify the general will of its political community. And one of the things that this means is that Rousseau's conception of politics is one that has very little space, if any, for the political party as we understand political party. Because the political party just is a partial association. It's a group of people who get together to push a particular ideological agenda or to push the interests of a particular subset of the population. And those kinds of partial associations or factions, according to Rousseau, always tend to corrupt the deliberations of his popular sovereign. So although obviously Rousseau can have had no real conception of the mass political parties that we're familiar with in the Western democracies today, I think it's very, very hard to imagine him being enthusiastic about them. I think it's also important to notice, going back to the earlier point about law-giving and legislators, that in effect run through Rousseauan language, political parties function in modern Western democracies today as more or less permanent lawgivers, right? They're the organizations in our society that set the agenda for democratic discussion because they're the organizations that propose legislation. They're the ones who say, well, we want to have healthcare for all, or we want to have social security reform, and here are our proposals. And those are the proposals that we get to vote on in general elections. And I don't think modern general elections are anything like what Rousseau has in mind, but we can still think of the political parties as functioning very much as lawgivers, as legislators, as Rousseau understands that role, because they're the ones who craft the proposals on which the people eventually vote. But insofar as political parties are completely beholden to particular interests, they represent the interests of particular social classes or particular groups of people or particular organizations, like, say, big corporations, right, or churches or other partial associations. They're clearly crafting this legislation in a way that is going to be biased towards particular interests. And that clearly deviates from the kind of model of law-giving that Rousseau has in mind. So I think there can be no doubt that Rousseau would look with horror at modern Western democracy, dominated and controlled as it is, typically by a duopoly of two major partial associations, the two major political parties in, for example, the United States, or in Britain, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. These are just two factions for Rousseau, and they just tend to corrupt the deliberations of any popular sovereign. And so his ideal is a society in which no such partial association would influence political deliberation to any great extent. A second institutional precondition that Rousseau mentions, and this again goes back to something I mentioned in the last lecture and something that he inherits from Hobbes, Rousseau insists that we keep clear the distinction between the government, that is the cadre of officials who populate various public roles and public service positions in the executive branch or even in Congress. That part of politics, the government, has to be kept distinct from the sovereign itself. And the sovereign is always the full body of the citizens who retain at all times final oversight over the structure of the politics of the political community, right? Rousseau says that the government, and this is a quote, is an intermediate body established between the subjects and the sovereign for their mutual communication and charged with the execution of the laws and the preservation of liberty. But Rousseau makes it absolutely clear that as a merely subordinate intermediate body, communicating, it was shuttling backwards and forwards between the subjects and the sovereign, right? It has an absolutely secondary subordinate role. It's ultimately answerable to this more fundamental sovereign entity, which is the full body of citizens voting on the general rules of the state. Rousseau repeatedly says this is something that is clear in a lot of the social contract, but it's perhaps clearest in the passages from the 7th letter from the mountain in the excerpt that I posted on Colab. Rousseau says there's a standing danger that the government, the apparatus of day-to-day political organization, the machinery of day-to-day political administration, that basically starts becoming a law unto itself. It gets unmoored from the sovereign and increasingly ignores and is not subject to oversight by the popular sovereign. And when that happens, all is lost, according to Rousseau. When the government becomes a kind of entity in its own right, a kind of law unto itself, then we've lost the ability any longer to discern the general will. And again, that implies that one institutional precondition for the emergence of the general will is vigilant oversight of the government by the sovereign, right? And I'll come back to that point in a moment. Let me mention one other institutional precondition that I think deserves mention. It's pretty clear, and here his reverence for Geneva and other city-states is particularly clear. Rousseau makes it very clear that the formula that he's offering is far more suitable in relatively small states, probably relatively small city-states. He's very, very pessimistic that anything like the kind of model that he's proposing is viable and workable in any large-scale political society. And so one implication of Rousseau's arguments in Du Contrat Social is that countries like the United States that are attempting to kind of run popular self-government, Republican rule, small Republican rule, across a continent containing hundreds of millions of people, this is a project that is doomed to fail from the beginning. And so Rousseau might say, well, it's not a big surprise that you find a system that by now has become completely corrupted, and which it's almost impossible any longer for members of American society to clearly recognize anything that looks like the general will. All you get is this endless contestation between various different particular wills that kind of duke it out endlessly through an extremely tiresome and cumbersome political process that wastes an enormous amount of public time and money and gets nowhere, and is still responsible for repressing the freedoms of the individual. So, it's very hard to believe that Rousseau would find much to be enthusiastic about in representative democracy as it exists in modern large-scale democracies like the Western European countries, Australia, Canada, the United States. That doesn't seem to be something that he regards as a good idea. There are also certain economic preconditions for the emergence of the general will. Rousseau makes it clear that to the extent that people invest in the economy as an occasion for private acquisition, that will tend to corrupt public discussion. As he says at one point, the private will tends by its nature towards preferences, and the general will towards equality, and he quite clearly has economic inequality in mind here. Though you should keep in mind that his worry about economic inequality isn't just really a material one. What he's bothered by when some people have a lot of money and others are relatively deprived of wealth in relation to elites and privileged classes, his worry isn't so much just a worry about the raw unfairness of the distribution of wealth. His worry is that those large-scale inequalities of wealth introduce dependence of some people on others. And that kind of dependence implies unfreedom, right? So the extreme example of that is, of course, slavery, right? I mean, the slave is entirely dependent upon his master for his well-being, and has to do whatever his master tells him to do as a condition for him being kept alive. And in that situation, the slave has no independence whatsoever. And that's, of course, an extreme example of unfreedom. But Rousseau recognizes that other forms of deprivation that fall short of full-blown slavery nonetheless introduce a certain degree of dependence. People often forget that one of the major early 20th century arguments for a welfare state was the need to socialize public provision in order to avoid the danger that more impoverished members of society would become excessively dependent on private philanthropy. And the problem that lots of people were worried about is that if you've got the poor depending excessively on private philanthropy, they will come to depend on these philanthropists and will eventually become, in essence, beholden to them. They'll feel that they have to kowtow to their benefactors in a way that is not really consistent with people being independent and free. And so one of the arguments for a kind of relatively impartial welfare state that just guarantees individuals a certain level of welfare is that undermines this sense of personal dependence of the poor on the wealthy for, noblesse oblige, for various forms of favors, right? And Rousseau, I think, thinks in a very similar way. He says, with regard to wealth, no citizen should be so opulent that he can buy another, and none so poor that he is constrained to sell himself. And what's clearly in the back of his mind here is the distorted political relationship, the relations of dependence and subordination that can thereby develop between wealthy and poor when you have excessive economic inequality. And as I've said, he clearly regards economic acquisitiveness on one's own behalf as a major source of political corruption. As I've already said, he would surely look with dismay at the role of big money in American politics today. Early in his formation, Rousseau was very, very heavily influenced by Plato, and one can see lots of Platonist echoes in Du Contrat Social. In this sense, he's not really a modern in a pure sense, because he's often looking back to these ancient models, as you can tell from the text, like Sparta, and some Aristotelian ideas and also some Platonist ideas. But his notions about the relationship between economic and political power are one of the places where this Platonic influence is clearest, because those of you who've read Plato's Republic will know that Plato says, well, the one thing you've absolutely got to do if you want to have a good and just and stable society is to make sure that political leaders cannot convert their political power into economic power, right? And he goes so far as to say that in an ideal state, political leaders would therefore be prohibited from holding any private property whatsoever, right? They would just live off communal property, right? And his point there was to make sure that the people who become powerful in a society aren't motivated to pursue political rule because they desire to parlay their political power into personal economic advantage. He sees that, as does Rousseau, as a major source of political corruption. I think it's also important to mention that Rousseau, at various points, not only in the social contract, is quite enthusiastic about laws that curb conspicuous consumption and limit the extent to which people engage in luxury and buy pointless, wasteful luxury goods. So he's sometimes a fan of what are called sumptuary laws, that is laws that restrict what kinds of clothes you wear, so that no one is wearing anything that looks too ostentatious, right? Because he's worried that this is going to get people caught up in pissing contests about who's got the more designer labels and who's got the bigger car and the bigger mansion and so forth. All of this he regards as politically corrupting. So there are some important economic preconditions that he thinks will help the general will to emerge. There are also important cultural and psychological preconditions. Apathy about politics for Rousseau is a danger to popular sovereignty. Apathy towards the common good devitalizes popular sovereignty for him. As he says in Book 3, Chapter 15, once someone says, "What do I care about the affairs of state?" the state should be considered lost. So I take that to imply that for Rousseau, the general will requires a vigilant, wakeful sovereign, not a Hobbesian sleeping one. If we have a Hobbesian sleeping one, a sovereign that kind of sits back and lets the machinery whir away and takes no active interest in overseeing the political process, then the state is probably going to corrupt itself and go bad, and the general will won't emerge. I couldn't resist noticing when I was indulging these various metaphors of sleep and wakefulness in this context, that there is, of course, an interesting, and I think not probably entirely unaccidental, connection with this way of talking today about woke people who are alert to oppression. I think that there really is, this is, I mean, it sounds like a pun, but actually I think there is a deep philosophical conceptual connection between the way people talk today about those who are woke, who are alive to the dangers of oppression in their society, as opposed to paying no attention and looking the other way and drinking the Kool-Aid and being seduced by complacent ideologies and so forth. I think Rousseau is in many ways the forefather of that kind of approach. Rousseau repeatedly says that the general will is the fruit of patriotic zeal. Love of country is very, very important for him. The general will is only going to emerge from a popular sovereign insofar as individuals in a strong way identify themselves with the state, right? And this is this business about the moi commun, right? The common me, right? They have to see the general will as just as much their will as are their particular interests, and have to be disposed to give priority to the general will because they see it as part of who they are. And this, for Rousseau, is as much a matter of emotion and affect as it is a matter of the kind of rational appreciation for rules of equity and justice. And along those lines, Rousseau also follows Hobbes in calling for a civil religion, a religion that will instill love of justice and respect for laws and for the state. His civil religion, as he says in his chapter on this towards the end of the book, will be like Christianity, and indeed for Rousseau, all religions, in being intolerant of some outgroup, right? I mean, all religious dogmas, Rousseau thinks, draw distinctions between the sacred and the profane, the godly and the heathen, the righteous and the unwashed, right? That's just in the nature of a religious outlook, right? There are the good guys and there are the bad guys. And so, like any such religion, his civil religion will be about identifying the bad guys, if you will. And this is, of course, grist for the totalitarian interpretation's mill, the enemies of the people, right? Those who we want to oppose, right? But although his civil religion should be intolerant in that way, Rousseau is careful to say that it should be intolerant only of intolerance. And he specifically has in mind here the intolerance that you associate with traditional theistic religious traditions, like Christianity. So he's very explicit about saying that his civil religion should not tolerate those forms of Christianity that preach loyalty to God over loyalty to one's fellow citizens, right? People who go around condemning other human beings as wicked sinners in a kind of self-righteous way. Those are the kinds of people, Rousseau thinks, who are a danger to popular sovereignty, because there's a sense in which they are misanthropic. There's a kind of anti-humanitarian impulse behind that. And this is part of something that Rousseau regards as true of Christianity more generally. He regards Christianity as otherworldly, as distracting human beings from what matters here on earth and focusing their attention on some utopian other world, the afterlife, heaven beyond, right? And that there's something cowardly about that, and that it's also often repressive of earthly vitality. This element of Rousseau's critique of Christianity looks back to Machiavelli. You know, in the Discourses, Machiavelli says that Christianity made the Roman Empire weak by turning Romans into cowards and instilling in them all sorts of scruples about being cruel and violent and so forth. And so things started to go wrong in Rome for Machiavelli when the Christians got control. And it also looks forward in some ways to the criticisms of Christianity that you find in Nietzsche. This idea that Christianity is ascetic and tends to repress perfectly legitimate human urges that are worth hanging on to and using and enjoying. That too is, I think, an element of Rousseau's remarks on religion generally and his civil religion in particular. So let's go back now in the closing part of the lecture to this conflict between the liberal and totalitarian interpretations, right? So not surprisingly, the totalitarian interpretation leans pretty heavily on a lot of the things I was just talking about. You know, Rousseau's very strongly worded views about civil religion. His insistence that citizens need to totally alienate themselves to the sovereign. This inculcation of an exacerbation of patriotic zeal. His willingness to entertain sumptuary laws in which people are prohibited from wearing clothes that are too conspicuous or too luxurious. Think Handmaid's Tale, right? I mean, everybody has to wear these same plain clothes in order to, render everybody equal. There's something of that in some of what Rousseau has to say. This idea that you have to be forced to obey a law that is really yours, even if you voted against it, and therefore you don't recognize it as such. And some of the rather sinister things that Rousseau says about legislators who establish political communities and reshape them so as to be capable of general willing. Rousseau talks about this in terms of a transformation of each individual into a part of a larger whole. If we just look at that passage, he who dares to undertake the establishment of a people should feel that he is, so to speak, in a position to change human nature, to transform each individual who by himself is a perfect and solitary whole into a part of a larger whole from which this individual receives, in a sense, his life and his being, to alter man's constitution in order to strengthen it, to substitute a partial and moral blah, 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 blah. And, people read that passage and they suddenly see images of the Hitler Youth, doing exercises on the lawn and so forth. And they think that there's a totalitarian element in what Rousseau recommends as ways to promote an uncorrupted mode of popular sovereignty. And that may be right, but I think this totalitarian interpretation also overlooks a lot. It's very important to keep in mind that Rousseau's patriotic zeal is not oriented towards love of abstractions like a race or a nation or a class, or a particular set of religious dogmas, right, like those of the Catholic Church, which he hated, like many of his Enlightenment contemporaries, right? His patriotism is oriented not towards that kind of fascist, communist, or xenophobic, or ideological, or religious form of group formation. All of that for him would be an example of a particular group and the formation of a particular will that then basically colonizes and takes over the public good. And he's very unenthusiastic about that. So his patriotism is oriented fundamentally towards cultivating a sense of love and respect for the dignity of individual freedom and independence. Again, he may have betrayed this in some of his pragmatic recommendations, but I think in terms of his aim, it's very difficult to think of him as a forerunner of any of these more fascist, organicist kinds of nationalism. His nationalism is a civic nationalism based on reciprocity and respect for individual freedom. Even the civil religion passages, it's important to recognize that he sees his civil religion as excluding only really intolerant religions. But it preaches religious tolerance and is clearly happy to accept a wide variety of doctrinal and religious practices as long as they're all mutually tolerant. And he rejects the idea that you should have any exclusive national religion. And to the extent that fascist or communist totalitarian regimes instituted something that looks like a kind of religious fervor with regard to a particular ideology, the ideology of Aryan purity in Nazi Germany, for example, Rousseau is fairly clearly set against anything that looks like that. And again, modern totalitarian regimes tend to be centered on dirigist and highly ideological political parties, like the Bolshevik Party, or like the Nazi Party, or the Juche Party in North Korea. But this is not Rousseau's model, I think, at all. Rousseau absolutely hates political parties, because political parties are partial associations. They can't represent the whole. The only thing that can represent the whole are individual citizens voting as individuals in an open-minded and independent way in the General Assembly. And again, participation in ideally Rousseauvian popular sovereignty isn't a matter of mass mobilization by political parties who are engaged in some kind of contestation over some set of rival proposals from different particular points of view. Rather, he is clear that when you participate in popular sovereignty, you do so in a radically individualist way. You don't communicate with anybody else. You don't conspire with others in a particular political party to kind of rig outcomes. You withdraw as an individual to your study, and you contemplate in a good faith way what would be for the best for all of your free and equal fellow citizens. And so I think that it's, in the end, for those reasons, a bit difficult to think of this position, at least in intention, as pointing in any clearly totalitarian direction. Should we then say that Rousseau is just a kind of proto-Rawlsian philosophical liberal whose general will is nothing more than just a set of universal abstract principles that remain the same in all countries and at all times, that just define a kind of ideal of justice in terms of equal respect, reciprocity, mutual reverence for individual freedom and dignity, and so forth? Is that really all there is to Rousseau? And I think that is an aspect of Rousseau's view, but I think the liberal interpretation is also importantly misleading, because I think, unlike someone like Rawls, for example, Rousseau isn't particularly interested in justifying an abstract or utopian ideal theory that gives us a philosophically systematic account of what a completely just and equal social order would look like. He's much less interested in that. He's much more interested in the question of how a democratic people can not only achieve equality, justice, and freedom for themselves, but also can affirm it as their concrete common achievement, reflecting their actual commitment to love and respect each other as members of a free, self-determining political community. Again, I think once you see this, it really does become clear that Rousseau has, in the end, to think of his political ideal as applying really only in relatively small political communities like city-state, because it's really only then that this commitment to love and respect one's fellow citizens as free individuals is going to, be able to be strong enough as to be not diluted in a kind of vast mass of millions and millions of strangers, as of course happens in the modern state. So the focus, I think, in Rousseau is much more on this kind of democratic aspect of his ideal than anything specifically liberal, and it's more political than it is philosophical. What's, I think, important about the general will for Rousseau is not its invariant universalistic content, which I think he accepts. I think he does think, and at various points says, look, the general will in its basic outlines, it's going to be more or less the same in all societies, because the freedom and equality of the individual is going to be more or less the same thing in all societies. But that's not what's really important to him about the general will. What's really important to him are the specific and diverse ways in which actual democratic publics concretely assume common responsibility for the dignity of their individual members and take justifiable pride in doing so in a manner that is distinctively their own, right? If you want an analogy for what Rousseau, I think, may have in mind to reconcile this with the universalistic commitment that he's talking about, think about Boeing and Airbus, right? There are general truths given by engineering and physics, right, about what an airplane that's able to efficiently carry 350 people a certain distance across an ocean at a certain speed is going to have to look like, right? That's why Airbus planes and Boeing planes, don't look that different when they're pulled up at the terminal, right? So in that sense, the basic principles of the design of a good jet airliner are pretty much set, and they're going to be, more or less the same. So the different manufacturers of airplanes, as they try to construct different kinds of airplanes for different kinds of markets, they're going to wind up constructing planes that don't look that different from each other. But A, there are differences, and B, the workforce of Airbus and the workforce of Boeing, what they're primarily interested in is the fact that they designed this particular airplane with this particular set of features. Yes, it observes certain general principles of aerodynamics that are in common to all aviation, right? But the pride that they take in their product is given by the particular way in which they approximate those principles and produce particular distinctive products of that. Think of the way the jumbo jet, the 747, has become a kind of icon for Boeing, right? There's a certain kind of pride that the people who've worked for Boeing can take in that particular airplane, its particular features. And I think that's the kind of model that you've got to sort of take when you think about Rousseau. Yes, the general principles of equality and freedom, largely invariant across different societies, but different societies will do it in their own way. And when they really do it in their own way, and do so because they love one another as fellow Britons, as fellow Americans, as fellow Luxembourgians, as fellow Genevans, right? That's the more important part of the story. It's how it's actually done in practice by democratic publics assuming common responsibility and disclosing and affirming and pursuing their own general will. Okay, that's enough. I'm a little already over time, so have to stop. Thank you very much for listening, and again, I apologize for the lateness of these lectures.